Okay, let's begin. Thanks. If I can have the next slide, please. So, as I think you'll have appreciated, is now become the practice in this conference, I'd like to acknowledge traditional custodians and territories. And I'm sitting in Brighton in England, in the United Kingdom, and we have a very troubled past if we look at it in terms of colonialism. And I will say that while the global majority, which includes many people who lived during those times, wouldn't necessarily identify themselves with the extreme practices that came out of Europe and particularly out of Britain. At one point, they proudly boasted that about a quarter of the world was red under the domination of the British Isles. And what we do still have here is access to resources that definitely have depended on that history. And I'd like to make full acknowledgement of that and say that we live with that, but I hope that we can change that in our lifetimes. And with that, I'd like to move on and start to introduce the session. There are some rules, perhaps guidelines here for being together, which are about being kind and about being mindful. If I just leave them here for a moment, I think they're all things that you would naturally be wanting to do, like listen deeply and care for the people who are speaking, muting your microphone and things like that. And that I'm going to encourage you to put questions in the chat so that I know that you've got a question. The way that it's going to operate at the moment is that we're going to have a video and then a chance for any clarification questions. When those are done, we'll move on to the next video. And then we have all the speakers, not all the speakers, not all the authors, but all the speakers here. And we'll have 15 minutes at the end when more substantial questions might be asked across everybody. And there's also going to be a panel on eco-justice coming up in a couple of weeks' time. So we have a chance to warm up here and then pick it up again there. So if we could go on to the next slide, please. I would like to welcome Liesbeth. She has a number of co-authors. I'm one of them, as it turns out. And I would like to invite Pauline to put on the video so that we can watch it together and then hand over to Liesbeth for any immediate questions.
We are going through an unprecedented climate crisis rooted in how societal life is constructed. As design researchers, we are all aware of the fact that this requires an urgent radical change that is not self-evident. Environmental challenges are often addressed apart from their societal dynamics. This enhances or risks to enhance polarization on climate-related topics. Different world experiences and views conflict. This is demonstrated by the recent floods in the Low Countries. The institutional projects that aim to raise awareness on how we as inhabitants of these countries should deal with water in our environment often clash with the means we have to deal with them. The confrontation between worlds is especially apparent for those who have paid the most for the effects of the water crisis, those who, for instance, live in the destroyed houses by the floods. They are often the people who cannot choose where to build their house or have the means to take special water measures. This demonstrates how environmental issues are experienced and perceived in many different ways by different worlds and are thus better called socio-environmental challenges. This social character of the environmental crisis has raised awareness of governments, researchers, and organizations of the need to address environmental challenges in participatory ways. As researchers involved in participatory design processes around socio-environmental issues, we have described that the experience with setting up participatory processes has grown in many organizations we work with. However, we also observe that the relations they build up with diverse worlds remain often institution-driven. They have an aim, such as designing more water-resilient housing, and they want to gain support for this aim from different worlds, such as inhabitants, organizations who build infrastructures, or municipalities. People who respond to these participation processes are most often those who are already interested in these topics, the most affected by or opposed to the institutional measures. In this approach, many people remain silent. In order to address those who are silent, we have described in previous work that there is a great need for complementing the institution-based approach with a more careful approach to participation that aims for a better understanding of the different worlds in which people live and work. The participatory design field has built up rich experience in creating more understanding of and synergies between worlds in technology sectors, and more recently also when dealing with socio-environmental challenges. However, the capabilities needed for doing so have not been sufficiently articulated, shared, or integrated into advanced participatory design research and education, as was the case for PD's valuable work in technology sectors that has been discussed in the first Routledge Participatory Design Handbook. Therefore, we, as a group of 13 researchers connected to 7 institutions, started investigating a framework for research and training in participatory design called Reworlding, a way of thinking and designing the world as a world where many worlds fit. During the past 2 years, we organized internal and external workshops and training activities. The workshops engaged with the question what design capabilities are required to enable next generation researchers to identify, develop, and implement design approaches that articulate and tackle the connections between worlds in addressing socio-environmental challenges. Based on the experience with the Participation Studio, an approach of University of Hasselt that investigates and imagines the participatory ways in which public and private organizations work, we explored 4 reworlding design capabilities: retracing, reconnecting, reimagining, and reinstitutioning. These were, for instance, discussed in the DASIS Philosophy Talk workshop at the Nordes 2021 conference with a group of 40 design researchers. As an example, we referred to our own case study related to water, and the participants were asked to bring their own case studies tackling socio-environmental challenges, which led to more precise definitions of the 4 foregrounded design capabilities. The participants defined retracing as a necessary activity of engaging in situated encounters with diverse worlds to discover collective ways of doing and caring for socio-environmental challenges. For instance, the question was raised: how can design capabilities start from tracing different cultures of living with water that challenge institutional assumptions on how water should be used in the house or the garden? The participants thought that this capability can support designers to visualize different views on matters of socio-environmental concern. The participants considered reconnecting as a capability of looking for new synergies between existing ways of doing and caring at specific locations by co-designing translation objects between them. As one of our participant notes, we need perhaps to listen to the inhabitants and the water rather than claim that it is silent, and listening with different ears can contribute to a more multifaceted understanding of water as a non-human actor. To capture that multifaceted understanding in the water case study, we made a visual water atlas. The participants articulated reimagining as a capability of improvising and experimenting with more caring situated designs that reflect the connections between worlds. In the water project, design practices of depaving, removing, and undoing the build, for instance in private gardens, reimagines traditional expectations of what it means to build by design. However, The practices of depaving also needed to be reimagined in relation to the worlds of people who do not consider a depaved surface as clean for inviting friends and family. Finally, the participants discussed reinstitutioning as the capability of working across scales, communities, and institutions to co-steer and challenge planning and policy. For instance, it was discussed by the participants that water companies often perceive water issues from a technical viewpoint. As the participants noticed, reinstitutioning capabilities can help shift their perspectives by articulating the microecology of rainwater collection, for instance, which includes very diverse actors and species, such as the smell of water or the insect it gathers, that these companies initially might disregard as irrelevant, but can inhibit people to collect water in their gardens. The discussions were supposed to result in an atlas of reimagined capabilities, embedded in their corresponding contexts in order to be transferred to other PD researchers and practitioners. The participants found it very important to co-define a few principles for these capabilities. First, they are defined based on experiences in the situated contexts of socio-environmental case studies. Second, they support bringing diverse actors together to act upon socio-environmental urgencies in contexts of increased societal polarization. Third, they are defined as collective capabilities that are built together by a group, organization, or institution. And fourth, they all share a re-prefix as an indication of our alignment with anthropologist Escobar's call for reworlding as redesigning the world. Some workshop participants were worried that the approach of capabilities might become linked to a belief that in a design process, capabilities can be neatly distinguished from each other. To avoid this type of instrumentalization, it was discussed that the development of capabilities needs to be framed as a situated practice that can never be disconnected from the actors and spaces they engage with. The separation of capabilities is then only to be used as a working method that helps to translate a reworlding approach into educational purposes and learning environments. In summary, capabilities were defined in this research for reasons of transferring, but without sacrificing their situatedness. How this can be done will be further addressed in the next steps of this study.
You're muted.
Thank you very much, Liesbeth, for presenting that, for making that video. Can I ask whether there are any immediate questions, either of clarification or any more detail that someone might like before we move on? Because we have actually a few of the co-authors here. Okay, well, I think then what we'll do is we'll keep other thoughts, but if you can start posting questions and thoughts in the chat, that would be great. And thank you for a lovely presentation to get us started there, Liesbeth. And might I ask Paulina to put up Michelle's presentation now? Thank you.
Thank you for attending this presentation on the paper titled Digital Gardening with a Forest Atlas, Designing a Pluralistic and Participatory Open Data Platform. My name is Michela Westerlaken, and this paper is written together with Jennifer Gabriz and Danilo Orzedo as part of the Smart Forests Research Project. And today I'm talking to you from Cambridge in the UK, a place that has been at the center of epistemological colonialism and science imperialism for a very long time. I'm originally from the Netherlands, and also here my ancestors have violently dominated the world in terms of both territorial and cultural imperialism. And this research is about forests, and forests are at the center of indigenous struggle for land, livelihood, survival, and epistemological justice. And as part of this land acknowledgement, I want to draw specific attention to those indigenous cultures that are almost always excluded from this increasing attention towards traditional cosmologies. Those that are actively and violently erased through all means possible, and not only by the Western world. My own deeply transformative and everyday connection to embracing non-Western cosmologies is through the Kurdish indigenous culture of my extended family. Kurdish cosmologies have been erased, and Kurdish people are used as pawns in many geopolitical conflicts. Their forests are under threat from all sides. Hiç dostek, veç kalequestan. We have no friends but the mountains, is a Kurdish proverb that connects this struggle to their lands, traditions, and more than human relations. And learning what this means is an ongoing and very difficult process. The Smart Forest Project investigates how forests are becoming digital environments and what are the socio-political impacts of digital technologies that monitor and govern forests. Worldwide, such digital infrastructures include technologies such as forest sensors, satellites, drones, tree planting apps, restoration platforms, and monitoring devices that are transforming forests, shaping forest governance, and impacting local communities. The online platform that we created for this project aims to provide tools for stakeholders, including researchers, technologists, governmental institutions, NGOs, local and indigenous communities, and more than human entities who are residing in diverse places across the planet to gather, explore, share, and discuss forest-related open data. And when we started to design this online platform, the Smart Forests Atlas, we undertook a design inquiry into open data platforms and environmental atlases that already exist. So these include experimental projects such as the Feral Atlas or environmental data platforms such as Global Forest Watch. We also specifically looked into digital platforms created and used by indigenous communities such as the Amazonia Alerta and SOMAI, both engaged with deforestation events and fire monitoring in the Amazon. And we reflect on these platforms in more detail in the paper itself. We then also came across this concept and practice of digital gardening, which is a relatively recent phenomenon that describes a particular way of designing a web space for sharing and archiving content and ideas in progress. So instead of polished blog posts or web pages, digital gardening involves more free-form, unfinished, and playful reflections and content sharing. This concept is actually extensively discussed among designers, so there are like Reddit groups, blogs, and other online communities that are sharing best practices for this. But within academia, this concept is still absent from discussion. So this gardening metaphors refers to growing, nurturing, seeding, or fertilizing your own personal website. So growing different kinds of plants or content and requiring continuous care for the digital garden to flourish. And these type of web spaces enable more public knowledge generation, more transparency on the process, and more participatory reflection. So in case you're interested in reading more about this concept, I really recommend this page by designer Maggie Appleton, and she outlines the history of digital garden in relation to earlier forms of hypertext storytelling. However, by reading more about the idea of digital gardening, we also found that this concept actually risks reinscribing existing colonial and anthropocentric understandings of gardening. Because on the same page, several instances of this become clear that I'm showing on this slide. So gardening is also described as claiming and controlling space, removing or pruning weeds and unwanted content, establishing order, and taming wilderness. So these instances demonstrate that the idea of gardening, when it is understood only within a Western or Eurocentric context, can turn into sites of extractivism and epistemic erasers. Such understandings are historically linked to ecological destruction, colonial plantations, and botanical taxonomy. So in other words, digital gardening, while offering a very helpful design concept, also risks to reinforce practices of controlling content, limiting unwanted growth, and cultivating pre-configured ideals of a perfect botanic garden. And so through the design process of the Smart Forest Atlas, we try to discuss, to challenge, and to expand this concept, to bring it more in conversation with decolonial research. So the design process of the Smart Forest Atlas started in March 2021. And after looking into these existing open data platforms, environmental atlases, we then identified design characteristics. We then also commissioned Design Cooperative Common Knowledge, who helped us to further design and develop the Smart Forest Atlas in more detail. And this process also involved a design workshop and various interviews with project members and stakeholders. And so now, after almost 1.5 years of design and development, we have a first iteration of the Smart Forest Atlas that is live. And I'm really happy to show you a short demo and then conclude with the design qualities that have really helped us then to identify how this practice of digital gardening can be expanded. So welcome to the Smart Forest Atlas, an open data platform, living archive, and virtual field site that brings together stakeholders and researchers in exploring how digital technologies are transforming forests. Although atlases have historically been used as colonial tools to mark out territories, the Smart Forest Atlas instead seeks to draw connections and generate plural and emergent knowledges. There are no set guidelines to navigate the atlas in a predefined manner. We encourage wandering. So 4 interconnected wayfinding devices can help with this. So logbooks share existing Smart Forest related projects. Each logbook contains multiple short entries with unfinished thoughts. And then stories, they are slightly longer and more in-depth reflections on atlas materials. And the map offers a spatial representation of digital forest geographies and their connections. And the radio gathers interview podcasts with practitioners, field recordings, and more than human soundscapes. But the most experimental navigational feature of the atlas is the tag network on the homepage. So all content can be tagged with keywords by the authors, and these tags form an underlying network through which atlas visitors can create their own pathways through the site. The homepage shows a tag cloud network with 30 tags that change when the page is refreshed. And when clicking on a tag, a side panel shows the different items that contain this tag. And the same tag network algorithm also shows related tags for each entry at the bottom of the page. And we hope that the tag network and the 4 wayfinding devices will encourage visitors with an interest in forests and digital technologies to follow their curiosities and create their own pathways to learn about forests and digital technologies globally. We also aim to use the Atlas as a digital method and open data platform to grow research and knowledge publicly and experiment with new forms of pluralistic and participatory knowledge generation. So through this design process, we propose to expand the idea of digital gardening with 6 additional design qualities. And design qualities here are understood following Schauenbardt-Zell, with the aim to help both critique and generate design. So these 6 qualities focus on building relational commons, enabling epistemic justice, expanding participation, transforming digital infrastructures, cultivating wayfinding, and moving through praxis through aspects of open data, data plurality, more than human data, sustainability, and unexpectedness. Each of these 6 qualities are outlined in more detail in the paper and also connected to existing research in the field of participatory design and decolonial design and other related areas. And articulating these qualities has really helped us to identify our aims and values while creating and testing this atlas. And then it's also guiding further iterations that we will expand upon in our next testing and design phase. So these qualities are not meant to indicate universal design principles, but instead they are a search for generating more pluralistic, participatory, and dynamic design approaches to digital gardening. So the Smart Forest Atlas is now live at atlas.smartforests.net, and I would really like to invite you to take a look. This is the first moment of sharing this link publicly, and we would really love to hear any thoughts on this work so far. Thank you very much for joining this presentation.
Thanks, Michelle, and congratulations on getting that up and live, because that must have been a huge undertaking. Can I ask whether there are any immediate questions of clarification or more detail that anybody would like to ask before we go on to the third of our presentations now? Okay, well, I'm not seeing anybody putting their hand up or indeed putting anything in the comments. So, Polly, if I could ask you then to take us to Barbara's presentation. And I think we'll see the link. Thank you very much.
Hello, everybody. My name is Barbara, and I'm a designer, a professor, and researcher in design here in Rio de Janeiro, Brazil. I'm very glad to be with you in this PDC 2022 for the presentation of my paper, Reassembling People, Redesigning Forests, Reforesting Democracy. All over the world, we are witnessing a strong shaking of democracies, both in the countries considered as central and in the so-called peripheral ones. Democracies are being challenged by authoritarian regimes. In parallel with this phenomenon, all over the world, forests and their population are being threatened. Entire biomes are being lost, directly affecting the global climate. Faced with this situation, this paper aims to provoke reflection on the possibility of reforesting democracy by reassembling persons and peoples of the forest and beyond. Climate change denial and democratic denial, the urgency of reassembling. With the election of Trump in USA and Bolsonaro in Brazil, the relationship between climate change denial and democratic denial became very clear. Faced with this challenge, intellectuals started seeking theoretical and practical paths. Bruno Latour is one of them, with his conceptualization of a political ecology that articulates political assemblies and scientific assemblies. And more recently, seeking to get down to earth, redesigning assemblies of humans and non-humans. And also institutions as United Nations, among others, are seeking ways of confronting global warming. Big events like the COPs, the Conference of the Parties, on one hand, promote official assemblies, and on the other hand, provoke assemblies in the streets, that is, protests from social movements and others. While political paths are being sought, forests continue to burn. It's urgent to reassemble, but who and how? Reassembling people for the climate, reassemble people of the forests. Assemblies exist since ancient times. In ancient Greece, they were attended only by men. Women, foreigners, and slaves were excluded. In recent history, assemblies of all shapes and colors have emerged all over the world. Arab Spring in Indonesia, Occupy Wall Street in USA, June process in Brazil. These assemblies are rather ephemeral. How can we consolidate them? Some cases can guide us. First case, reassembling people for the climate in France. Thierry Peck tells us about the case of the so-called Gilets jaunes. They began to protest weekly against the increase in taxes on fossil fuels and against the reduction of carbon emissions. Government and society then co-designed a citizen climate convention, where convention means an assembly of 150 citizens with special attention to their social diversity. The second case, reassembling people of the forest in Indonesia. Anand Singh tells us about the conflicts that arose with the installation of a logging company in the Maratus Mountains region. Some citizens advocated a right to multinational development that included forest products, while others advocated forest conservation through village-based developments. Sting brings out the complexity of those frictions, which range from interfamilial relations to global connections, and incites us to think that frictions do not prevent collaborations. On the contrary, they reinforce collaboration between actors with different points of view and experiences regarding the forests. Indigenous people, activists, academics, nature lovers, and even entrepreneurs, considering that the forest itself is an assembly of varied plants in close collaboration. The question here is to what extent these experiences at the initiative of governments and or societies and communities, whether in big cities or in the deepest forests, can contribute to a redesign of the forests and at the same time to a reforestation of democracy. Redesigning forests from infrastructuring to reassembling. Here the question is brought explicitly into the field of participatory design. The concept of infrastructuring implies not only recognizing the social cultural practices of a territory, but also through design, interrelating humans and non-humans for the emergence of new practices. Infrastructuring requires distributed agency among different participants to allow appropriation of opportunities and share decision-making within the design process itself. But to address initiatives such as the COP and the CCC, and to focus on issues of democracy, diversity, and difference, we propose the concept of reassembling, as reassembling people may touch the most sensitive nerves on the relationship between climate change denial and democratic denial. We could propose assembling, but we insist on reassembling to emphasize, on the one hand, that's necessary to assemble in other ways than in modern forms, and on the other hand, that it's an ongoing process. Reassembling by means of design is urgent. Reforesting democracy. If the ideas of reassembling peoples and redesigning forests can be well perceived, the idea of reforesting democracy generates strangeness. Perhaps what makes it strange is the persistent dichotomy between nature and culture. To get out of it, Manuela Carneiro da Cunha analysis of the rubber tappers' struggle in Amazonia is very inspiring. She emphasizes that the rubber tappers thought they only produce rubber when, due to the very characteristics of their activity and ways of life, they also produced biodiversity. The Amazonian biodiversity has been as co-designed by the rubber tapping activity, a contradictory mix of extractivism and preservation, as the social diversity of the citizen climate conventions has been co-designed by a conflictual interrelation between government and citizens. We bet on the constitution of these complex and conflictual assemblies between non-humans and humans, and always including those who think and act differently from us. These are the forest-like connections with all the frictions that reinforce collaborations. Only this way can we imagine and materialize a reforestation of democracy. This implies an effort that is as local as it is global, to which participatory design with its theories and practices has much to contribute. Here are my references. Thank you to all these authors. And thank you, obrigada, for your listening. In memory of Chico Mendes and Bruno Pinheira and Tom Phillips, and with gratitude to the indigenous people of Amazon.
And thank you, Barbara, for another very rich paper. That was super. And there has been one question of clarification from Simran, who I think Michelle has tackled in the comments, if anybody would like to have a look at that. So I want to pose a question to our speakers here and say, you found yourself in a session on eco-justice, and I wondered if you could relate your work a little bit to that theme, because it runs right through the presentations we've been hearing. But I think if now that we've heard all three together, it would be really interesting to have those reflections. And so could I, Liesbeth, would you mind addressing that a little bit for us?
It's indeed interesting that the three lectures are framed in this in relation to this term, because they all seem to deal with the facts that these very complex ecological challenges are very interconnected with our society and how we live together. And I guess the reason, why at least we initiated the research was from a finding in research practice that often the ecological challenges are tapped into from a very engineering focused perspective, very technological, forests, water issues, greening. It's a specialization in a professional specialization, and they're good experts. And of course, they have the knowledge on how to deal with these complex questions. But what they experience, of course, in reality, is if they want to bring their very nicely found out solution to society, it raises a lot of discussion. Some people really don't understand some of the proposed solutions, or feel that they are imposed on them. So there is a real need, and that's what I liked from also the last presentation, this idea of reassembling. There's really a need to go away from the very distant looking at a forest and claiming that it's good or bad to do this or that, but rather to assemble in and with the forest, to start to understand and feel and experience what a forest is made of, because that makes the discussions often very difficult, because the common inhabitant, also me, before I started working with water, it was very difficult to imagine how I could live with water in my own home. It's only by embedding yourself into the topic and into the ecosystem that it becomes more tangible. So I think there's this aspect of eco-justice. It's not equally divided how we can or may deal with these ecological challenges. And it's very easy from a higher educational perspective to judge people on how they handle it. So we have to deal with these things much more carefully and with close attention.
Thank you for that very full answer. Michelle, would you like to come in?
Sure, yeah. I mean, I can only add to that. And Liesbeth, I really also liked how you framed this this problem of these kind of social problems being sort of separately addressed from the environmental ones. And I think that's something that we've also been kind of encountering in talking to many different stakeholders during this sort of 1.5 year that this project has now been running. And so that makes me, I mean, in relating it to eco-justice, it makes me reflect on how that idea of justice is something entirely different for some of the people we've been talking to, and sometimes contradicting with each other, as well as we've talked to sort of highly technological people, as well as people who actually live in forests. And that becomes sort of almost, it doesn't align well with each other. And then it's really a challenge to come into that space as a designer with participatory design intentions and trying to see what we can do with that. So it's definitely been, part of a struggle, I think, to understand what this actually means, this eco-justice.
Thank you. And Barbara, might I invite you to reflect on this too?
Yes, thank you, Anne, and thank you, everybody. Well, I have to say that my English is a little bit poor, so I try to enter this conversation Well, I loved all the papers, and to try to answer to Anne and to add something more. I think that when we think about eco-justice, we think immediately in our forests, in our rivers and trees, in our countries or territories, and this is very important. Well, I'm speaking from Brazil, so I think that you know what's happening here, and I think that we have to think about this, but and also related to people, to people of these territories. We don't have to, we cannot forget people. And I think that when we talk about eco-justice, we have to think about social and environmental challenges. I think that the papers that we have presented here talk about this together in a careful way and in a very articulated way. So I try to bring some examples in my paper just to emphasize that really we have to put these things together. That's thinking in an ecological way. Social and environmental, they have to be together. Thank you.
Thank you. And one of the things that's come back to me, and I think you were talking about articulation here, and we've had this emphasis on the reassembling, retracing, reworlding. We've had a real attempt to find language to express something which perhaps, were you talking about the strangeness that comes from talking about reforesting democracy or foresting democracy, and or questioning what a forest is, or Liesbeth has just referred to what it means to live with water, and maybe then you're subject to a number of different emotions that are not just things you can talk of. And so I'm really struck by the work that, the kind of creative work that's being done here, both with language and the need for more, perhaps more creative work in language, because it's become so much. It's definitely the rich part of this that you're expressing in papers, but it also feels when we're talking that there's more to be said. And I wonder if anybody would like to respond to that, because these terms are perhaps unfamiliar to the wider world. So what does it mean to kind of explode a forest and think of it as an assembly? And maybe one of the forest people can comment on
that. Is it a question for me, Anne?
Either you or Michelle, or in fact, Liesbeth talking about water. What language do we need really now? And how do we communicate this way that is actually different from we've become very technical. And I think Simran has picked up this kind of, you use the term smart forest and then you deconstruct it. But for a lot of people, that's a very persuasive way of talking about the future. So what work are we doing here? Because it feels like there's a lot of work going in here expressively about how we talk about this.
Yeah, maybe I can comment on one thing about language. There is this, but I also have a question in relation to that, to the Atlas of Forests, because what we try to do actually with the Atlas in the water case is to really make also an atlas of expressions and wordings that people use to talk about water, because we think we know how people think and feel about water, but for instance, we heard many times water is dirty, for instance, and that is really not what we, from our perspective, was the first thing we thought about, because if you don't listen and look carefully, you miss a lot of associations that people have with forests or water, or so therefore we found it very important to build up this atlas, to create a vocabulary, to start exchanging between inhabitants, water companies, the city, and so on this water issue. And in relation to that, I had indeed a question to the forest atlas. So what were you exactly looking for when you were making the atlas of the forests? Was there what were the cases or the stories? How did you select them? Because you took a global perspective. I took a neighborhood perspective. That's a totally different perspective. So just curious to hear how you build up your language.
Yeah, there's a lot of things to speak to here, but yeah, so the way that we started out the project was to try and sort of see what's out there. So we started a large literature review, and then we kind of got also overwhelmed with the amount of stuff that was there, and how can we actually start relating to this and start talking to people, you know, during the pandemic, sort of from distance, doing like these sort of 1-hour Zoom interviews with people from across the world and also from across disciplines. So we have people in the project from geography, from forestry, from conservation, from digital media, and then design. And so, yeah, different. And they sort of have also different entry points into already kind of people that they were already familiar with, or projects that they were already familiar with. And so we tried to find a way to bring that together in this atlas without closing it down, but with this, with this idea of plurality and relationality. And it's interesting that you mentioned this kind of idea of articulations and language. And then because we in the homepage, like working with these tags, like trying to find like what happens when we allow external contributors now to come in and kind of use the kind of words that they feel relate to the different content, and then to see what happens was a bit challenging for me, as I'm sort of not used to kind of being so language based in my work, and then kind of trying to see what happens now. So I'm really curious as to how this platform is going to be used by others, and how we can then kind of iterate upon the design based on that usage. So trying not to sort of anticipate too much what will happen now, because I think that's really tricky thing to do. And I wanted to actually extend this as a question to Barbara as well, because I found it really interesting in your presentation how you use the word forest in the reforesting. And I feel like, and it can also be perhaps working across languages, perhaps something else can be unpacked there as well. I'm feeling, because it's kind of both about the actual forest, and it's also kind of metaphorically used, and it's sort of, and this whole term seems to like bridge between the two, and I think that's really interesting. So I was wondering if you wanted to talk a little bit more about that.
I try. Yes, thank you. Well, let's see, before with the language issue. Yes, I agree that we are trying to imagine words, and that part of this work is we have to invent other languages, expressions, and sounds. I think to think how sometimes it's difficult to think, but sounds inspire us. As far as I'm concerned, when I thought about a reforestation of democracy, and perhaps I can answer to Michelle, I thought that I really needed to breathe, to breathe a little bit the air and the sounds of the forests, to try to think of another politics, to be what was happening here in Brazil and in the world. I think that we have to need to think with our whole bodies, to find other paths in design and in the world. I think that Liesbeth, Michelle, and I, we are trying to do these things. The forest is really a metaphor, as you said, Michelle, is a metaphor, but it's really real. As I'm not in the forest in Rio, but one of my examples comes from Rio, and a kind of experimentation in design and thinking, where we think about the city of Rio as a very complex tissue. And so it's as a forest. I try to think as a forest to work even in a very urban context. So yes, it's very metaphor, but it's very real and concrete. This other way of thinking, the complexity of our issues and all the actors that we have to involve in this process. Well, I tried to answer. Thank you.
Thank you, and thank you for helping me with these questions that you're asking each other. And can I also encourage people in the Zoom room to add their questions, or perhaps raise a hand if there's something that you would like to know from either any one of them or all of everybody here. And the one thing that I'm sort of now playing with in my mind while we see that there's anyone else is when we were at the Participatory Design Conference, and you've produced these wonderful assemblies and assemblages. And I was wondering practically, where does participation come into this work then? How do we do that in a way that is kind and just with so many different kinds of people involved? So perhaps we can talk a little bit about what this calls out of us in terms of practice. And you may start in any order, but it could be Liesbeth's turn again.
I will go back to the water case just to keep it simple. So how do we start from participation there? What we often experience in our role actually is that municipalities, Flemish governments, for instance, and local municipalities, they have a mission, they want to really engage people in these new ways of dealing with water. And they know why they are doing it. There's nothing wrong in that. But what we try to do is, and actually what we observe is that often the ones who should participate, in this case, all these inhabitants who maybe have to change their ways of dealing with water, less pavement, more containing of water, they really say, what do they want from me this time? So that's always the first reaction. They want something from me, and I should participate in another project. Last time it was about energy and so on. So it's very difficult to get them into the participatory process. So our role is more to start them from there, and that's maybe where the language comes in. And the Atlas, their way of handling water on a day-to-day basis. And look, okay, what you are doing is interesting. We're gonna visualize it and allow people to see from each other how they handle this. So there is a first exchange on their current practices. And only after that, the experts enter into the conversation on how they would handle it. And it becomes a very different conversation. So what I noticed is that participation is not participation. There are many ways of participation, and the one is not better than the other. But there should be many more relations between these different participatory entry points. So that's always a big challenge, and certainly in these ecological projects, because also often the experts on the ecological challenges also have their ways of dealing with participation in their projects. So many paradigms come together.
Yes, no, that's lovely. Thank you for that insight into it. And well, since we're going through in order, Michelle, may I turn to you?
Sure. I think in working on this particular platform and in this project, I found this idea of digital gardening when I first started reading about it. I found it really interesting, actually, because of that kind of, it's a different way of perhaps thinking of participatory knowledge generation and trying to see like, how can we build something that is online and that ideally tries to share different parts of research as open data before it's sort of synergized, so before it's kind of worked into a paper or worked into like even like a blog post, like trying to find different ways to generate knowledge in public, and then trying to see how different people can become part of this. And then of course there's like the practical element of then how can you actually do that, because I mean I mean, ideally, this would be sort of even more open, right? Or everyone would be able to add anything, but then there's other kind of constraints that limit that, or how can that be built out further? So yeah, but I think that concept and practice of digital gardening and the way that it's used by designers, I mean, there are a lot of people building sort of personal websites with this kind of approach and trying to find different kind of ways of representing their work online and things like this. But it's, yeah, I found that quite interesting because it offers this new, it offers like another kind of approach to participatory knowledge generation than I was familiar with. So.
Thank you very much. And perhaps I can hand to Barbara now for a short reflection before we start to wrap up.
Okay, thank you. Well, as I said, we had all over the world a very strong cycle of assemblies in the world. I mentioned the Arab Spring, but also here in Brazil, we had many assemblies in 2013. So participation in assemblies in this context is immediate, but they are also, it's very difficult. The participation process is very difficult. And many of these experiences, the experiences I mentioned, did not lead to an improvement of the democratic situation in these countries, quite the contrary. And one example is what happened here in Brazil. So I think we have really to analyze much more what happened and try to continue to improve these participation processes in democracies. Well, thank you.
Well, thank you all. Thank you very much. We've literally got a moment or two to wrap up now. So I want to thank the three speakers for some fascinating ideas, really complex, really profound, and the way that you've been able to relate that to the questions that I've posed, and actually made a great deal of sense across that. And I'm also draw people's attention to the fact that there was a very nice little discussion going on in the comments, which reflects thinking about these kinds of things and about kind of what it means to re-enchant, and how I think that underlies some of what we're hearing here too. Before we go, I just want to draw people's attention to the rest of the schedule, which I believe Paulina has a graphic for me. But I just want to thank everybody so much, because I've just found it such a fascinating discussion. I could have sat here a lot longer and talked a lot longer, but I hope that will still be a chance with all of you together or individually over the next weeks, days and months. So here we have the rest of the day on the, no, we don't. We just have an overview. Sorry, I don't want to mess it up when you've all done such a fabulous job of being coherent. But here we have tomorrow. This is the one I was expecting. Here we have tomorrow. So thanks, everybody. And I look forward to seeing you in other rooms, some of them real. I will be in Newcastle talking a little bit about this and about some other things that are hard to express at the end of next week. And thanks, everybody.